Hello, my name is Pastor Robert Martinez, and I've chosen for my teaching assignment from the text of Mark chapter 10, verses 42 through 45. The Bible says this, "But Jesus called them to him, and saith unto them, Ye know that they which are accounted to rule over the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and the great ones exercise authority upon them. But so shall it not be among you. But whosoever will be great among you shall be your minister, and whosoever you will be the chiefest shall be servant of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many." The story goes of a young girl who was standing by, or happened to be standing by, a cop who was taking down a report from a recent accident that had taken place not too far away from them. She came up to the officer and tugged on his shirt, and the officer noticed and looked down and said, "Yes, ma'am, may I help you?" And the young girl proceeded by saying, "Officer, my mother told me one time that if ever I needed any help, I could always talk to an officer and he would help me. Is that true?" And the officer looked down and said, "Yes, ma'am, that is true." And he continued about his report and taking down notes and so forth. And the little girl tugged at his shirt again, and the officer looked down and said, "Yes." And she said with a big old smile, pointing down to her shoe, saying this, "Officer, can you tie my shoe?" Service, humility. And you know, here in our text we see the disciples coming to Jesus, and they're already thinking about their retirement, so to speak, and where they're going to spend eternity, and how their placement in heaven is going to be, and so forth. And James and John specifically asked Jesus for a seat right next to him, one on the left, one on the right. Their idea of ruling was obviously out of perspective, and so Jesus confronts all his disciples concerning this idea of rule and service. And I want you to notice with me specifically here in the text, number one, the otherwise disposition of the Gentiles. In verse 42, we see that Jesus called them unto him and said unto them, Ye know that they which are accounted to rule over the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and their great ones exercise authority upon them. Jesus points out the approach that the Gentiles had toward leadership, or their approach, or their disposition of leadership, right? And it is expressed by the two phrases. He points that out. He says exercise, they exercise lordship over them, and they exercise authority upon them. And so there's these two different ideas, over and upon. It was this mentality, the status of over and upon another being. And so Jesus Christ points this idea out that this is the way that the world approaches it. This is how the Gentiles approach leadership. It is a matter of over and upon another being. And their exercise, or their practice, so to speak, was to lord over and have authority upon those that were directly under them. And of course, Jesus points this out, and he wants to give a kind of a contrast as to what true leadership is, and what true leadership looks like, and what true leadership does not look like. And so you see the otherwise disposition that the Gentiles gave. And secondly, Jesus gives the opposing directive. And Jesus gives his command or directive to his disciples by saying, "Not so among you." And so he kind of draws this contrast. Hey, look, here's how the Gentiles do it. Here's how the world approaches or practices leadership, but not so among you. He's saying this is their world, this is how they do it, but not so in my world. And so we see this picture and this contrast that Jesus Christ draws as to how you and I ought to approach this world, and how you and I ought to be leaders in this world, as opposed to the way that the world does it. And so he was absolutely opposed to the world's approach to leadership, and so should we. We should not approach leadership as a matter of lording over or exercising authority upon. And the idea really here is more of a suppressive meaning, like they were suppressing in their leadership. They were ruling over or bearing down in their leadership. And really, in the end, truthfully, this really causes more of a disgruntled servant in the end, and somebody who can get discouraged by leadership that is overbearing or overruling. And so Jesus naturally says, hey, this is not the way you do it. This is the way the world does it, but this is not the way you're to do it. Not so among you. The idea and the overall theme in this passage is the difference between structured lordship versus servant leadership. Structured lordship versus servant leadership. And so this idea was important. This idea was important to point out, as James and John were definitely confused and misunderstood the true meaning of greatness. And I think really that's the idea. What is greatness, right? And servant leadership brings about a different greatness as opposed to a structured lordship. They bring two different styles, two different end results. And Jesus wanted to point out that difference, and specifically here, as I said already, James and John were kind of confused and misunderstood what greatness truly meant. And he said in verse 38, actually, you've seen that he says, "Ye know not what ye ask." So they had no idea really what they were asking for, and their idea of leadership and their idea of greatness was kind of shallow and faulty, so to speak. And so Jesus delivers the true picture on the opposite side. You'll notice that he says greatness in verse 43. We see that verse there. He says, "But so shall it not be among you, but whosoever will be great among you shall be your minister." And verse 44, "And whosoever you will be the chiefest shall be servant of all." And so this word greatness is minister in the King James. It comes from the Greek word diakonos, which means servant. And so verse 43, it was basically the minister was the servant. Chiefest is servant of all. The word all is from the Greek word protos, which means first. And so greatness is being servant of all. And that's the real idea of what greatness is. It's being servant of all. Not lordshipping, not having lordship over people or exercising authority upon people and suppressing them, so to speak, but rather serving them. Lowering ourselves to a position where we can become effective by serving others. And that's what we ought to do. We ought to be servants of others. In the economy of God, service or leadership, or even greatness for that matter, is looked at as simply serving, servant leadership. And that's how we ought to lead and how we ought to guide and how we ought to direct people. Not necessarily trying to suppress them, but serving them. And there's a big difference there. And so you see the opposing directive from Jesus. But thirdly, you see the obligation delivered to his saints. He doesn't just stop there by saying, hey, that's not the way you do it. All right? But he delivers an obligation to them. And the obligation is, Jesus flips the script a little bit and delivers an obligation to them all, not just to some either. The truth is open to verse 43. He says, "Whosoever will be great among you shall be your minister, and whosoever of you will be the chiefest shall be your servant of all." And so it was applied to everybody, every Christian, every believer, every child of God. Whosoever is open to anybody. And so it was not just to some. You can practice. It's not just like you can practice servant leadership, but you can practice the other way around, right? Suppressing and so forth. No, it was to all. Whosoever wanted to be great, whoever wanted to be the master or the chief, was going to be the person who needed to be a servant. And that's exactly what God wanted us to do. And so the spiritual principles remain the same even to this day, even to this age of believers today. And that is this: as Christians, followers of Christ, we are to exemplify servant leadership and not the world's concept of greatness. Not the world's concept of greatness, but rather servant leadership. And so greatness today is in humble service to all others, not in others serving us. And I think that there's a huge difference there, right? When you approach ministry, when you approach others, you shouldn't look and say, how can they serve me? It should be a matter of how can you serve them? In what way, in what fashion, in what manner can I serve the person that God has put before me, and so that I can exemplify true biblical servant leadership and true biblical greatness for that matter. And so we're obligated to serve others, right? And so he delivers this obligation. Whosoever, hey, listen, I don't care who you are. Anybody you want to be great, anybody want to be the chief of all, you're going to be a servant. And so the obligation is there to be a servant above being great. And lastly, we see the original demonstration by Jesus Christ himself. And we see that in verse 45. The Bible says, "For even the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many." And so Jesus gives the best template or example for servant leadership in verse 45. And then he's the original demonstration for us all in this area of servant leadership. And that's one of the great things about God. He's just so great. He doesn't just tell us to do something, he shows us how to. And Jesus is the perfect template. He's the original demonstration, the original template as to how we are to serve others. And he gives this picture here in verse 45, "For the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many." He laid his life down. That's how far Jesus Christ went in this area of servant leadership. He literally laid his life down, and of course we see that through the cross of Calvary. But up to that point, he was very servant leadership focused and not trying to exercise lordship or authority upon people. He was very lowly and humble and willing to serve, and we definitely see that in many facets throughout the scriptures in the lives of the disciples and also in those outside of that inner core of his followers. But Jesus Christ is that perfect example. And so Jesus was simply setting the bar high in the area of biblical greatness. In essence, he was saying this: go to the grave in giving your life for service to others. Go to the grave and giving your life for service to others. And I want to just read this real quick from Warren Wiersbe. Warren Wiersbe says this. He says, "Unless we know how to obey orders, we do not have the right to give orders. Before a person exercises authority, he or she must know what it means to be under authority. If Jesus Christ followed this pattern in accomplishing the great work of redemption, then surely there is no other pattern for us to follow." And how true that is. You know, servant leadership over, structured lordship. There's two different paths, right? And we think, we want to get to that point where we want to glorify God in a great way. But in order to get to that point, we have got to practice servant leadership rather over structured lordship. There's a big difference. Both may lead to somewhat of a path of greatness, but the true biblical pattern that we ought to follow is in the pattern of servant leadership. And that's what we see throughout this passage here. As Jesus Christ gives the otherwise disposition, the opposing directive that he gives to them, the obligation that he delivers to them, and then of course the original demonstration that he gives even through the very life of himself going to Calvary. So the question is this: when is the last time that you tied someone else's shoes?